Welcome to the Young Widow Podcast, and thank you for joining today for episode 7, The Little Things No One Tells You, part 2, Daily Life. I'm Britany, your host, and I'm happy you could join today. It may sound weird to say that, right? I'm happy you could join for a talk about widowhood, but this is what I do, and my intent is to reach as many widows as possible. So if you found my podcast, that actually does make me happy, regardless of the topic that we're talking about. Last week, we talked about the little things no one tells you about, like the death certificate. That was an emotional episode for me. Yes, it is 5 years into my grief now, but I think it's important to say that talking about different portions of my grief still activates triggers and emotions. So I kept last week short, and I wanted to separate it out into 2 parts. And this week, I really wanted to go into daily life. There are things that I didn't know in daily life that were going to be triggers or real aspects of my grief, simply because I didn't know and because no one told me. So the things that we're going to talk about this week are going to be daily life relative to household tasks like grocery shopping or doing the lawn, and the mail that keeps on coming. We are going to talk about different types of triggers relative to daily life. The types of triggers that we are going to cover are going to be locational triggers, task type triggers, and then uncontrollable triggers. So let's get started so we can cover all of these, as it may be a little bit longer of a podcast than what I usually like to do. So daily life. We lose a person in our life, and we know this is going to upset our daily balance. We don't know really how much that's going to upset it. If somebody you lost is deeply intertwined in your life, like a spouse, you may not realize how significant this is going to be until it is. I know that I didn't. I know that I didn't realize how much I depended on my spouse for everything that was co-balanced across our life. That all of those things that I now had to do alone once he died became triggers. They became reminders that my husband had died, and they threw me into a grief cycle. The first type of trigger that I want to talk about is a locational trigger. A big thing for me after my husband died was grocery shopping. We lived in a small town, and there was only one place to go and one option. It was the local Food Lion. It's the place that we went to for groceries for the better part of 7 years. So our life was actually really intertwined into this grocery store, but I didn't realize how much it was going to affect me. I remember one of the first times I went into a grocery store after he died and the funeral was over. I can distinctly recall it being like a movie in front of me. People were hustling and bustling and moving around. A place that once felt so familiar, that was something that I encountered in my daily life, now felt completely unknown and daunting to me to be inside the grocery store because my husband had died. I remember walking down the aisles, looking at food items, trying to go through a list of what I needed to shop for, except for what I needed to shop for and look at wasn't what I looked at. As I walked down those aisles, the tears started welling because I saw his favorite chips, the seasoning that he used to make tacos, which I really loved. I walked down the cereal aisle and I saw the cereal that he ate every morning for breakfast. And slowly, those tears in my eyes became a full emotional breakdown within the grocery store. I was standing in the cereal aisle crying. People were walking by and probably wondering what the heck is going on, but not one person said a thing. I have no idea how long I stood there. I couldn't tell you. It felt like hours for me, but I just stood in front of his favorite cereal and cried. At that moment, I had quickly decided that I was going to leave the grocery store. But then on the way out, I saw people holding hands. I was adamantly aware of the dads with their daughters, the couples together. So the grocery store was a locational trigger for me because my husband was tied to it. That short story is just one trip to the grocery store. I lived in that town for over 1.5 years after my husband died. I went to the grocery store numerous times, and numerous times I had emotional fallout. People would stop me in the parking lot and ask how I was doing or how I was holding up. I would cry in aisles as I came across other things that reminded me of him, and I realized I was really missing him that day. I actually grew to hate grocery shopping. I used to love it because if you know me, I love to cook. But after my husband died, grocery shopping and cooking actually became a trigger for me. Eventually, while living there, I got to a point where I could shop and there was less emotional events, but overall it was still emotional. It sounds crazy, right? To say that we had so many memories in something like a grocery store that it became a huge emotional and locational trigger for me. But it was. I had no idea that grocery shopping after my husband died would be a feat in itself. So where am I at with that now? I can grocery shop without crying. There are moments, even at times now, 5 years later, in different stores where triggers can happen. I'm just able to control them better because I've removed the general locational trigger that was relevant during my active grieving cycle. And that's what's important here. I could not go in that grocery store during my active grieving cycle without triggering a huge emotional fallout. But once I shifted into my post-traumatic growth cycle, probably 2.5 years into my loss, I was then able to work through my triggers. And now to this day, I can go grocery shopping. I can also go back to the grocery store that I used to shop at with my husband. And it is emotional, but it's not sad emotional. It's nostalgic. It's memories. Sometimes I go there to feel home and to feel him and to shop and get my groceries like we used to. But it does not cascade into emotional fallout because that locational trigger was specifically relevant to my active grieving phase. So why do we talk about this? Maybe you're feeling this way. Maybe it's not a grocery store. Maybe it's the post office. Maybe it's a place that you went to lunch. Maybe it's a place that you guys got dinner or had a coffee date, but it could be a locational trigger. And maybe that locational trigger doesn't serve you in your active grief cycle. Maybe it is too much in your grief cycle, and so you need to remove it. But that doesn't mean that one day you're not going to be able to go back and revisit it. One day, it could make you smile as you progress into your post-traumatic growth. It could become nostalgic for you. You may not believe me. I wouldn't have believed me if I was you listening to me in my active grieving cycle, but that's what I'm here for. I'm here to shed light to other widows and to young widows to let them know the things that I encountered, so that way they can take a step back and look at it and say, maybe I can implement something similar in order to help me grieve. Now I want to transition to task type triggers. Again, daily life, you choose to cohabitate with someone, you share responsibilities, and now all of a sudden they're gone and you have to do it alone, and it can result in task type triggers. For me specifically, a big task trigger was doing the lawn. My husband, Stephen, had always done the lawn. The lawn tools and lawn equipment was his. It was something that he took care of and enjoyed, but hated doing. And it was something that he didn't want me doing, you know? And so for me, after he died, I had to do the lawn. And I remember the first time I had to do the lawn, the thing that got me was the damn weed eater. And I wrote about it in my book, so if you read it, you know where I'm going to go with this. The weed eater is what caught me up in doing the lawn. My husband had changed the head on the weed eater, so there would be special blades and he didn't have to deal with the string. But when I needed to go out and do the lawn, I had to change the blades, except for I couldn't because the head was stuck. I couldn't get it unstuck. I tried for probably an hour or two and had no luck, so I called a friend. They came over and they tried to work through it too, and they couldn't. Neither of us could figure it out. The screws seemed stripped or overly tight, and nothing we did worked. But then I remember sitting there later that night and thinking, there has to be a way. Stephen would figure it out. There's some kind of trick I don't know, and I just need to call him. And I reached for my phone. But I couldn't call him because he had died. He was gone, and whatever he knew in his head on how to operate this piece of equipment, for the life of me, there were not enough YouTube videos to figure it out, and it ended up in complete emotional catastrophe. I remember laying on the garage floor crying, and it still makes me emotional now because I can remember specifically how I felt because it was that first big task trigger for me. And I just cried laying on the floor thinking, if I could call my husband right now, he could fix this. But he can't because he's gone. And I will never be able to call him again to fix anything for me in my life. So everything he knew, every piece of knowledge that he had in his head died with him. And now I will have to figure out how to be independent. It was a very long and very emotional night for me. So how did I get through it? How did I get through that task type trigger? Well, I am very good, even in my early stages of grief, at identifying triggers and then a solution. I'm a problem solver. It's what I do in my corporate job. And so I identified the trigger was a weed eater, and I realized I didn't want to deal with it anymore. I had two options. Well, actually three if I think about it now. My option was take it to get fixed, buy a new one, or pay someone to do it for me. And that's the one I landed on. The lawn was always something that was significantly tied to my husband. It was always something he did, and I felt like it was going to be a task trigger in my active grieving cycle that was going to continuously throw me off canter. And so I solved the problem to remove that trigger. I hired somebody to come take care of the lawn. I still, to this day, have the weed eater. I actually took it to get fixed as well, so I combined two of those. And it still sits in my garage today. But I don't use that one because it is a trigger for me and somebody else does my lawn. For me, that was a solution I was able to, and I was in a place to do that. For you, if that is your specific trigger, which could be really rare, that may not be something that you can do. You may not have the financial stability with your husband being gone to pay somebody to do your lawn, but there is some kind of creative solution that you can come up with. You're going to have a task trigger, and it's going to be something that you're going to have trouble working through. The whole purpose of me telling the story is to validate that for you and say, hey, maybe your task trigger is taking out the garbage. Maybe it's rotating the tires, changing the oil on the truck. Maybe it has to do with the lawn. Or maybe your husband's the one that did school drop off and pick up. Whatever that task trigger is, it's going to come about. You're likely going to have more of them, and you're going to have to figure out how to work through them. Unfortunately, you can't farm out everything in your life to not deal with your triggers. I was not able to do that either. And so there are going to be some that you're going to have to work through. And when you work through them, it's going to hurt. But I'm here to validate that for you and say, I went through that too. Thousands of other widows have been through that too. That doesn't mean that it's okay, but at least you know that you're not alone in feeling that way. And however small that task may seem to everybody else, it doesn't matter, because if it's a trigger for you, then it is relevant and it is important. And however you decide to handle those triggers is completely up to you. There are no rules in this, and there are no wrong answers. It's all about what is best for you. Okay, so the last little topic we're going to talk about is going to be uncontrollable triggers. So we've covered locational triggers briefly, and we've also covered task type triggers. So now I want to talk about an uncontrollable trigger. And an uncontrollable trigger in daily life is something that you encounter that you have no control over. For me, that uncontrollable trigger was the mail that kept on coming. When my husband first died, it was normal to receive mail in his name. I actually didn't think much about it. I opened the mail, took care of what was inside, and then notified them of his death and crossed it off my list and moved on to the next envelope. It was business as usual. Where this became an uncontrollable trigger for me was months and years down the line. It was after I had shut off all of his accounts, closed out everything relative to his life, and then the mail stopped coming until it didn't. It was the random mail I didn't expect is what got me and became an uncontrollable trigger. Let me give you an example. My husband passed away in January, and his birthday is in late August. So almost 9 months after he died, the first year, I received a birthday card in the mail for him. It was from a previous employer. I remember opening the mailbox, seeing a card, knowing it was his birthday, and pulling it out and being like, my husband's dead. Who is playing a sick joke by mailing me a birthday card for him? It was like salt in a wound. I was angry. I was resentful. I cried, and it was a huge emotional trigger for me because it was also his first birthday. And it felt like somebody was throwing it in my face. It felt like my grief was right there in front of me again. And that was just one instance in itself. This continued. I would get random mail sporadically, but I was still in my active grieving cycle. So every time I opened the mailbox and I saw his name, I would think, why is somebody sending me mail for him? How can they not know that he is dead right now? It may sound like a small trigger, but it's a trigger nonetheless. And it's a trigger because I couldn't control it. I couldn't control my emotional response to it. And there was going to be an emotional response to it, whether I wanted there to be or not. So where am I today? I have actually moved houses. I live in a completely different town. Nothing in my life exists with my husband's name in it. Over 4 years later, into my 5th calendar year of grief, I still sporadically receive mail for him. For a minute, when I open the mailbox, it's a quick stab in the chest. And then I toss it in the trash can as I'm thinking, how is this still happening? But it's no longer the emotional trigger that it used to be for me. And the difference is the grieving phase that I am in. I am in my post-traumatic growth phase. I am no longer actively grieving. As cliche as it sounds, sometimes you just have to deal with them, and it takes time. And if you know me, you know that I hate to say that. It just takes time. You have to go through it, and then eventually it'll be okay. Something like the mail, it literally took time for the mail to actually stop coming, and it's still randomly there, but it doesn't get a significant emotional response to me because of the work that I put in. When it comes to uncontrollable triggers, there's going to be a lot of uncontrollable triggers that you're not going to be able to broadcast in your life. An uncontrollable trigger like the mail, you can't control that. You can't control the spam mail. You never know when it's going to show up. You could be driving down the road and a song could come on the radio. That's an uncontrollable trigger. You're not the one that's DJing that radio station, right? But where there's a controlling mechanism is that you can change the station. You choose to listen to that song and invoke emotion, or you choose to change the station. Maybe an uncontrollable trigger for you is that on the way to work, you have to drive past the funeral home. Is it controllable or not? Is there a secondary route that you can take so that no longer is a trigger for you on your way to work and then upsets your workday? Both of those are examples of uncontrollable triggers that you can control a response to because you can change the situation. Something like the mail is purely an uncontrollable trigger because you can't control that at all. All right, so that was a lot to cover and not even close to everything that we could talk about in daily life triggers and then the different type of triggers. But just to go back over it. So we talked about the things no one tells you about in your grief cycle that are going to throw you off. And those are going to be 3 different types of triggers: locational triggers, task type triggers, and then uncontrollable triggers. When my husband died, I had no idea all of these things that seemed so mindless to us in our daily life would be so pivotal in my grief cycle. I had no idea because no one told me. No one openly shared the way it felt to go through daily life as a widow. And so if you're a widow listening to this, this is the whole intent of my podcast. I hope that you got something out of today. I hope that you have a little bit more knowledge of different types of triggers, but I really hope that you have validation in the way that you're feeling, because validation in your grief is actually what's most important in order for you to grow around your grief. So with that, I hope that you have a good week, and I will see you next Wednesday.